previous video, we checked out the time of supply for normal supply. In this video, we'll be looking out for the situation under reverse charge. What will be the time of supply for supplies on which reverse charge is payable? Now just remember a point. The time of supply would be the first instance when a revenue would arise. That is, either the payment has been received or the invoice has been issued or goods have been received, when there's a liability to pay or the payment has been made. When a revenue transaction is completed, the time of supply would be that, because the government can levy tax on a revenue transaction. That is the whole concept of time of supply. So what's the situation under reverse charge? First, let's recall what reverse charge transactions are. In usual case, the supplier would collect tax from the customer and pay it to the government. But under reverse charge, the supplier will not collect any tax, but the customer will have to remit tax on his or her own motion to the government on such transaction. And that is what is reverse charge. Because the receiver, the customer, is paying the tax, the liability to pay obviously rests on the receiver of goods, and the time of supply is from the point of view of the receiver, because he will have to know when he's supposed to pay tax and how much. And therefore, it's the receiver's point of view. We can divide the time of supply rules for reverse charge supply into two. One, where supply of goods is involved, and second, where supply of services are involved. So the first situation, supply of goods. Recall we have 6 situations in a transaction relating to goods and services, relating to payments, and relating to invoice for both the sides, the supplier as well as the recipient. Under time of supply, it's the point of view of receiver. So we'll have 3 things: the goods, payment, and invoice received by the recipient side. The time of supply under reverse charge for supply of goods would be the earlier of date of receipt of goods, date on which the payment has been made by the recipient, or the date right after 30 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. Let's try and understand the last one. The supplier issues the invoice. It has to reach the recipient. There would be a time lag between issue and receipt of invoice. So the law has assumed that this time lag is 30 days. This is for our understanding only. There is no provision stating this. But conceptualizing something like this makes it just much more easier to understand and retain the provisions. There's a time lag. We are looking at the time of supply under reverse charge from the point of view of the receiver. The issue of invoice is from the supplier. So basically, the receiver has to receive the invoice, and we assume that there would be a time lag of 30 days, and that's why the third criteria is date right after the 30th day from the day the supplier issues the invoice. So these are the 3 instances: receipt of good, date of payment made, and 30 days after issue of invoice by the supplier. Now, in case it's not possible to determine any of these 3 dates precisely, then the time of supply would be the date of entry in the books of receiver, which kind of shows that the transaction is final and the revenue to the supplier has materialized. For date of payment, the same situation as we'd seen in the case of time of supply under normal situation. The date of payment would be earlier of date on which the payment is entered in the books of the recipient, or the date on which payment is debited in the bank. Under normal supply, it was credited into bank because the supplier receives payment. Under reverse charge, point of view of receiver, date on which payment is debited, that's the payment has flowed out from the bank because the receiver would make the payment. So those were the 3 dates, actually 4 dates that you had to keep in mind for supply of goods under reverse charge: receipt of goods, date on which payment entered in books, date on which payment debited in bank, date right after 30 days from issue of invoice by the supplier. Earlier of any of these 4 dates would be the time of supply of goods under reverse charge. Next, let's check out the situation under time of supply for services under reverse charge. Now we had 3 dates when we talked about goods, but for services there are only 2. The receipt of services would not be counted for. So that's gone. We only have 2 situations, payment and invoice. But under services, it could happen that it's a long drawn out process. Therefore, the time lag is assumed to be larger. So date on which payment made or date right after 60 days and not 30 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. Those are the 2 dates that you have to keep in mind. Date on which payment made, date right after 60 days and not 30. Like we'd seen in the case of goods under reverse charge, if none of these dates are determinable, then the time of supply would be the date of entry in the books of the receiver. There's one special case that we need to talk about under this category, that's of associated enterprises situated outside India, related parties situated outside India. We'll not go into the definition of associated enterprise, just know that there's a clause in relation to this transaction. If there's a services supplied to associated enterprises outside India, then the time of supply would be earlier of date of entry in the books of recipient or date of payment, whichever is earlier, rather than the date of issue of invoice. That's a slight change, but generally it's date on which payment made or 60 days from the date of invoice. As always, date of payment would be earlier of entered in books or payment debited from the bank account. And therefore, as we did for time of supply under normal services, we can broadly generalize the time of supply under reverse charge. There are only 4 dates that you'll have to take into account. The first one is only for supply of goods, the date of receipt of goods. Second one, date on which the payment is entered in books, date on which the payment is debited in the bank, date right after 30 days in case of goods or 60 days in case of services from the date the supplier issued the invoice. And if none of these dates are possible to be determined, then the time of supply is the date of entry in the books of receiver. It is in these situations, when any of these occur, that the government has clarity that the transaction has taken place, the liability for payment has taken place. So there's a revenue stream which materialized and the government can now collect tax. So that's all about time of supply under reverse charge supply. In the next video, we'll check out the situation for supply of vouchers as well as the residual transactions.